All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brendan Yeager. I'm here today with my colleague Corey Clark to talk about the limited fiduciary, which really is a potential game changer when it comes to integrating the fiduciary rule into your contact center. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. On the left, or on the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see there is a space there where you can ask questions. We will have time at the end for questions, but if you do ask them as we go through, we will try to take a quick break between sections to see if there are any questions that we can address right away. So again, my name is Brendan Yeager. I'm one of the directors here at Dalbar. I head up our service quality measurement program, wherein we provide objective third-party evaluations of randomly sampled customer interactions to let financial services companies know what the quality of service that they're providing to their customers are and how they stack up against the larger organization. I have with me here today Corey Clark, another of our directors here at Dalbar. He heads up our research, communications, and due diligence areas. We do have both of our contact information here on the screen. We will be sharing these slides with you afterwards, so don't feel like you need to scribble that down right now. So I put together a quick agenda for us today. After we get through the agenda, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Corey, to talk about the fiduciary rule, just providing a brief overview, talking about how the fiduciary rule redefines advice. One thing we do want to talk to a little bit is the future of the fiduciary rule. I know there are some concerns out there as what's going to happen with this with the new administration coming in. So Corey will address that. He will also talk to how the fiduciary rule poses a threat to your business. He's then going to talk a little bit about, broadly, what are some strategies that firms are employing to integrate the fiduciary rule into your daily life. Then I'll come back on to talk specifically about the fiduciary rule in the contact center. And one area where I do want to spend some time, because I know it's where a lot of organizations are really planning on going to deal with the fiduciary rule, is that education-only approach. After that, I'll introduce the limited fiduciary, which is that potential game changer, talk about the advantages that this model will, let's explain what this model is and the advantages of it. Then again, we'll have time at the end for questions, but by all means, if you think of questions as we're going through, feel free just to type those in. And on that note, I will hand you over to my colleague, Corey.
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks everybody for attending today. The fiduciary rule has certainly garnered a lot of attention. It really seems to be the only thing people have been talking about over the last 6 months to a year. So much so that it's really reached sort of our mainstream media and our consciousness, because in fact I think it was a few months ago this topic was featured in John Oliver's show on HBO, and I think I can say with little reservation, when financial services regulations find their way onto HBO television, it's probably a pretty big deal. But most of the talk about the rule has been with the context of advisors and how advisors are going to deal with the rule, how they'll be able to preserve their compensation and their compensation structure, that is commissions. But there's been very little talk, or much less talk, about how it's going to affect the other parts of the firm's business, and one of those is the call center. The exemption that we're going to talk about today is the 408G exemption, and this has received a lot of attention with the financial services firms, but again, it's within the context of the advisor. It's an exemption that the advisors will use, and there will be some big players that will be announcing probably in the next few months their intention to operate under this exemption. But there's been very little talk about using this exemption in different contexts, such as the call center or potentially online tools or things of that nature. And it's really a shame, because it's a much more efficient and safe way for call centers to comply with this rule. And I know Brendan will talk a little bit more about that and how that is the case later on. But before we really go too much further, what I wanted to do is just simply level set a little bit, talk about what accounts are affected by this rule and exactly what the rule change is, just on a very broad basis. So, looking first at the accounts that are affected, it would be your ERISA accounts, your defined benefits, 401ks, ESOPs, and those defined, those retirement accounts, employee-sponsored retirement accounts, employer-sponsored retirement accounts that we all know and love, but also IRAs, HSAs, if they do have an investment component, as well as some 403Bs to the extent that those 403Bs are governed under ERISA. Some are, some are not. It depends on whether they are maintained and established by the tax-exempt organization. But also want to note that group insurance, life insurance, disability, those types of insurance products would not be included under the rule. So that's the universe of accounts that we're talking about today. Well, what is advice? So this really all stems from the definition of advice changing, and the real disruption that's going to occur is what flows from that change of a definition. So I think, as we all know, whether or not you're giving advice would define whether or not you're a fiduciary. And once you're a fiduciary, there's a different set of rules that you have to play by, and that's what has become burdensome for both investment companies, advisory companies, and really all the players within the industry. But today, and the title here is in the past tense for the sake of clarity, but in essence this actually is what advice is today and what it will be leading right up until April, is defined by a 5-prong test, and it has to meet all 5 of these prongs. So it has to be a recommendation, it has to be on a regular basis, there needs to be a mutual understanding that there is advice being rendered as a service, it has to be the primary basis for the decision, and it has to be individualized, and it has to be all of those things. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of loopholes there, and it was not too hard for advisors to provide a service that we would all intuitively think of as advice, but by the letter of the law in this 5-prong test would technically not be advice, and therefore that advisor would not have to play by the fiduciary rules. And that's what the Department of Labor was looking to clean up. A few other notes about what is, or I guess in this case what is not advice, is there's a distinction between advice and education, where advice would be fiduciary in nature, education is not. That actually isn't going to change. Now, what is advice and what isn't advice is what's going to change, but advice is still going, education is still not going to be advice. Today and up until April, RIA rollovers or advising on those rollovers is not considered advice, and neither would be recommending advisors or asset managers. And I think these last two are particularly important in the call center context because while not all call centers do these things, there are many that do deal with IRA rollovers and providing some guidance in that context, as well as pointing callers in the direction of a potential advisor if one is needed. So these are things that were not advice, and as we'll see in a moment, based on the new definition, these things will be swept in under the definition of advice. So April 2017 is when it will be enacted, and again we're going from a test in which all 5 of those components have to be satisfied to a new test in which if any of these 6 things are satisfied, then you have advice. And I think what's important to note here is that one-time recommendations will now be advice. And I think that was the lifeline to the call centers, because in most instances, if advice was given inadvertently, it's most definitely going to be a one-time deal. That caller isn't going to be calling back routinely for advice. It just would have been on a one-time basis, which would have protected the call center from being a fiduciary, because the inadvertent advice on that one-time basis wouldn't be advice. But starting in just about 5 months from now, it'll be defined as follows. It's any of these 6 things. And the first one being a recommendation as to the advisability of acquiring, holding, disposing of, or exchanging securities or other investment property. So you can see this is going to sweep in a whole lot of things. It doesn't matter if there's a mutual understanding. It doesn't matter if it was on a regular basis. It doesn't matter if it was individualized. All that matters is whether the recommendation was made and it was with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing of, or exchanging securities or other investment property. It also includes any recommendations as to what one should do after rolling over assets or transferring those assets. And that includes the amount, the form, or the destination. So this could be particularly important in the call center context for those of you who do provide some guidance at varying degrees regarding RIA rollovers. Also investment policies, strategies, portfolio composition, and lastly, the selection of other persons to provide investment advice or investment management services. And so no overview of the rule would really be complete without addressing some of the more recent changes that we've seen in our administration, and certainly a lot of questions now remain as to whether or not this rule will survive. And we believe very strongly that it will for a number of reasons. And so I wanted to go through those with you. The first is the public backlash. And maybe this wouldn't have, doesn't have as much teeth to it for this, a president who's had a lot of backlash already. So maybe this would be a drop in the bucket, not really a big deal. But it is hard to say that my policy is that advisors should not have to act in investors' best interest. It doesn't appear to be a top priority. Trump has mentioned, obviously, the Affordable Care Act. He's mentioned repealing Dodd-Frank, the wall, a lot of different things. But he's never specifically mentioned the DOL rule as being one of his priorities to get done. And there's a limited time that he has to do it, because once it's enacted in April, it's going to be far more difficult to repeal it at that point than it would be beforehand. And that there'll be a lot of constitutional questions about his ability to do so. And there'll certainly, the other side of the aisle, this being a very partisan issue, there'll be a lot of resistance, and we would probably see that go probably to the Supreme Court, injunctions, all of that, really making it a mess. Also, there would likely need to be a new Secretary of Labor by the time that this is done. And in order to become the Secretary of Labor, they're going to have to get confirmed by the Senate. They're going to have to answer questions as to what side they're taking on this rule. So all of these things combined really lead us to the conclusion that this rule is going to remain intact. It's just not a fight worth fighting for Trump at this point, and we expect to see this enacted in April as was originally planned. So a little bit about the threats to the business. What does this all mean? So we know how advice has changed. We know that playing by the fiduciary rules has threats, but what really are they? And we see it as a two-sided threat, one being the regulatory enforcement, that being the Department of Labor, and the other being civil litigation. Now, with regards to the Department of Labor, that's going to more revolve around the prohibited transaction, the fact that there's an exchange or a sale between the plan and a party of interest or one of those party of interest affiliates. This, I would say, is a smaller risk, mostly because of the fact that the Department of Labor does not have the staff to police this across the country. And they've really relied, and they've said this much, they've made no bones about it, they said it in the preamble, Phyllis Borsey has said it in public presentations. They're looking at the civil litigation, the plaintiff's bar, as being the mechanism to enforce this regulation. And this would be more with regards to the breach of fiduciary duty, prudent man rule. So when somebody loses money, they're going to want to blame somebody, and there's going to be a lot of plaintiff's attorneys that'll be happy to bring a cause of action against some CSR or someone who unwittingly provided advice. And when you're providing advice accidentally, it almost by definition is not going to pass the prudent man rule, because that person who gave incidental advice or accidental advice certainly couldn't have done the discovery or learned the facts and circumstances that they needed to learn in order to give a prudent recommendation. So we would argue that the civil litigation is probably the greatest threat as it relates to this regulation. Some of the strategies to avoid this, and really there's only three ways one can go to avoid this. You can either avoid fiduciary status altogether, so make sure that the communications you have with clients is education in nature only. course, with that comes challenges, gray area, training, all of that. You could have no conflicts of interest, meaning that it's okay. You can be a fiduciary, you have no conflicts of interest, so you're not going to run afoul of prohibited transaction rules. Unfortunately, in the call center context, there's really just no practical way that this would ever come about. The call centers are going to be conflicted by their very nature unless they were an independent entity and not affiliated with the investment company or the insurance company, what have you. So you can pretty much cross the second one off your list. You're not going to be able to achieve no conflicts under these circumstances. And then the third would be operating under an exemption, and there are a few different ones that can be used. The first being the best interest contract exemption. This was the new one that was created as part of this new rulemaking. There's also a level fee exemption, there's a computer model exemption, and then there's individual exemptions that can be filed for with the Department of Labor for specific unique circumstances. But what we're going to be talking about today is this level fee exemption, and that's 408G, which fits quite nicely into the call center context.
All right, so before I take over, I did just want to address one question. Someone was asking about whether or not you can get a copy of these slides. We will definitely be sending those out after the session today. Brooke Halloran will be sending it out, so definitely watch your inboxes. We'll make sure everybody gets a copy of these slides. We will also be posting a replay of this webinar at some time in the near future. So that being said, let's talk about where the fiduciary rule interacts with the contact center. So one thing I wanted to do to sort of set the stage for this discussion is we recently conducted a survey of contact center managers across the financial services industry. And one of the questions that we asked everyone who was participating in this survey is, how prepared is your contact center for the fiduciary rule? Keeping in mind that this question was only asked to those subset of respondents to the survey who do service covered products within their contact center. It's a little bit, you'll see 36% are very prepared, and this survey was issued in August, but you will see 46%. The largest group is only somewhat prepared, and then there's this 18% down here at the bottom that really isn't very prepared at all. So clearly the industry as a whole is still trying to grapple with how this rule is going to impact the contact center. And actually, to piggyback off that, another question we asked in that same survey is, how big of an impact do you expect the fiduciary rule to have on contact center operations? You can see by looking at this slide that 45% of contact center managers are extremely optimistic about how this rule is going to impact them. I'm afraid that they might be a little bit overly optimistic and perhaps could be in for a rude awakening once April rolls around. And part of this problem is what I would consider a potential fiduciary trap. Those situations where your customers do specifically ask for advice on the line. Things like, what should I do with, what do you think, what would you do? Or even, and this one commonly comes up in the context of when people are looking to take funds out, they have different mutual funds that they can take those funds from. We very commonly hear things like, oh, you decide, where they're actually really looking for that representative to tell them what to do. So we've been doing some testing. Obviously, this fiduciary rule is going to have a huge impact on the industry. So within my service quality measurement program, we're looking at contact center service quality. Obviously, this is an area where we're very focused on. We really built out some reporting for next year around the fiduciary rule. In preparation for that, we have been starting to sample these cases now. And we actually have found that these potential fiduciary traps, we hear them in a little bit over 3% of all consumer calls. So that's a pretty large subset of your customers that are actually coming right out and asking your representatives for advice. There's a reason that your representatives were hired into that role. It's because they're helpful people. They have that service mindset, which makes these potential traps very dangerous to them. So in going around the country visiting multiple contact centers, obviously I've been speaking with my clients about what is your strategy within the contact center to deal with this fiduciary rule. The overwhelming majority of people that I have talked to are really looking to go for that education-only model. Stating very clearly, We do not provide recommendations. Therefore, we have no fiduciary exposure. But the point I would want to make here is that that line between education and advice can be pretty blurry at times. And to give you a sense of what I'm talking about there, I'm going to move on to this next slide about what actually qualifies as a recommendation under these new rules. And an important point here is that the regulations really aren't that clear. As Corey had mentioned, the Department of Labor is looking for litigation instead of legislation to iron out the details. So to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about, I have a couple of audio clips that I'm going to play for you, just sort of highlighting that range of what might be considered a recommendation. So the first clip I have is an outright endorsement.
I'm not authorized to give advice, but this fund is on fire.
Obviously, that is not something you would want to hear your representative say. So clearly, that's a recommendation. But let's dial it back a little bit and look at just what a suggestion would sound like.
So I'm no longer with my employer, and I don't know what to do with this 401k.
I would speak to your advisor about that. Also, we can certainly roll it into an IRA right here for you. Would you like me to walk you through that process?
So that representative started off in a great place, directed back to the financial advisor. Can never go wrong there, but then he went that step further by actually suggesting that he roll it over right into an IRA at his firm and even offer to get started with that. Clearly, I would consider that a recommendation. But then as we dial it back even further, you get into that situation where information is provided looking to go for that education-only route, but that can be easily construed as advice. Let me play an example of what that might sound like.
Well, if you're worried about market volatility, we do have other investment options. We give you all the investments available for your policy at www.acmelife.com. We do have some conservative options out there, such as our large cap bond fund.
Once again, the representative in this case started out in a great place. Directing them online, there's client-approved materials out there they can look at. But once he named a specific fund, that could very easily be construed as advice from the person on the other end of the line. They are going to be much more likely when they go and look at those conservative options to select that specific large cap bond fund over those other options, and that's a direct result of the quote-unquote recommendation that was provided by this representative. And then if we can even take it a step further and just look at what's a gray area. Looking at cases where they're really only providing information, but the manner in which information is provided clearly leads decision making. So let's take a look at what that might sound like.
So which of your funds would you like the money to come out of?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think?
That's something we hear all the time, right? That what do you think? That's a potential fiduciary trap I was just talking to. Let's hear how this representative responds.
Well, you have the same fund in both Class A and B shares. If you were to take the money from the A shares, wouldn't be any sales charges, whereas the B shares, there would be.
Now that is just strictly stating facts. However, the way those facts were presented, it's clearly going to lead that particular customer to take funds out of that A share. Now, personally, I do not think that this is going to be in violation, but it's certainly in that gray area because the Department of Labor just didn't set those parameters very clearly. Within the SQM program, obviously, we're going to be looking at all of these. We would, for the first three examples, actually be putting a deduction for that representative in our scores, but even the gray areas we're going to highlight for information only for our clients just to really let them know exactly how broad this rule could potentially be. In that area, we're taking a very conservative approach. We want anything that could, under any stretch of the imagination, possibly be considered a recommendation. We want to at least highlight, though many of them will be for information only. So what are the potential flaws in this education-only model? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've been talking a little bit about my service quality measurement program, where we're providing objective third-party evaluations of customer interactions. Within that program, specifically looking at those lines that we monitor that would fall under this new fiduciary rule, all of the companies that we deal with train their representatives not to provide advice. Some of them are licensed, some of them aren't, but regardless, they don't have that complete picture of the caller's financial situation. And yet, in the testing we've done over the last couple of months, we have found that recommendations are made in almost 1.3% of consumer calls. That is with them being specifically trained not to provide advice. And most of these examples that we found so far, as we're training up our analysts to this, have been of those higher magnitude deductions. Not so much the endorsement, but those situations that are construable as advice or where they're making a suggestion. Now, keep in mind that this is according to the current rules in effect, where certainly a number of our clients are really planning on doing some retraining to really make sure that they're not crossing that line. However, I would definitely put out there that extreme caution to make sure that you're never providing information in any way that could possibly be construed as advice can really lead to a degradation of service. Let me play an example of what that might sound like.
I just moved and was wondering if I should give you my updated address.
Whoa, I'm not authorized to give advice. Look, I don't think I can answer that question.
All right, that might have been a little bit of an extreme example, but it really does illustrate that point that you can have this paralysis by fear. You know, you train and just beat it into their head so much that they absolutely cannot provide any advice under any any recommendations or any circumstances. It is very possible that something, maybe not quite this extreme, but things in this vein could certainly be the case. Definitely leads to a lower quality of service for your customers. At the same time, it involves some very expensive retraining of staff, and no matter how much caution you put into it, no matter how much retraining you do, you are never going to eliminate recommendations completely. You know, you're always going to have that rep who's trying to be helpful and just goes a step too far, particularly when we consider that those lines are not clearly defined. And so I just want to put that potential liability in context. You know, 1.3% doesn't sound like a lot, but if in your contact center you're taking, let's say, 500,000 calls a year, which is certainly not an outrageous number. I'm sure a number of you take more calls than that on an annual basis. That leads to almost 6,500 potential plaintiffs, and that's just in the first year. You know, by the second year, you're up almost to 13,000. By year 3, you're almost up to 20,000, and so on and so forth. Once this fiduciary rule is in effect, I can guarantee you that lawyers are going to be out there recruiting plaintiffs for their class action suits. When they're doing so, they are going to be targeting the deep pockets. They're not going to be looking to file suit against Joe Advisor. They're going to be looking to file suit against your firm because you have the money that they can get that payday that they're looking for. And that brings us to the limited fiduciary model. The limited fiduciary really grows out of the Pension Protection Act of 2006, which enacted 408G. One part of 408G is this level fee exemption. It's really designed to avoid conflicts of interest. Across the industry, there's a lot of situations where it would be very difficult to execute a level fee model, particularly when you're looking at advisor compensation. However, when you look at the contact center, level fees are almost a given. You know, your representatives are almost exclusively being paid in the salary. Maybe there's some other incentives on top of that, but the vast majority of their compensation is coming in the form of a salary that isn't varying based on any recommendations that they may or may not be making. What the limited fiduciary does is it really shifts that compliance burden from that individual CSR to the policies and procedures that you as a firm have put in place. So if you're doing your due diligence, it can provide you coverage in those situations where the representative makes those inadvertent recommendations. So there's really 3 benefits of taking advantage of this limited fiduciary or level fee exemption within the contact center. The first, and certainly the biggest, is that liability protection. When those trial lawyers come a knocking, you don't want them coming to your door. And the 408G level fee exemption can certainly help with that. It's a great way to minimize disruption within the contact center. And also, it has a very strong possibility to give your firm a competitive advantage over some of your competitors. Don't worry, I'm going to go through each of these in turn. Starting with the liability protection. So the 408G is going to cover those inadvertent breaches, like in those clips that we just heard, provided, there are some caveats here, that you have appropriate policies and procedures in place. most of your training modules probably are already quite specific that your representative should not be making recommendations or providing advice. Also, that it is not a pattern or practice of noncompliance. And, of course, that you're operating under that 408G exemption. What this does is it places the federal government and all the power and prestige thereof between your firm and those trial lawyers. This is a very significant protection. When looking to file those class action suits, I can almost guarantee that these trial lawyers are going to target initially the firms that are not operating under that exception, that are going to be much easier targets when they're filing suits, when inevitably some clients start losing money and are looking for somebody to blame. So getting back to that survey I did some time ago, one of the questions we asked is, what steps are you planning within the contact center to prepare for the fiduciary rule? And you can see a couple of these are very big: creating new scripts, talking points, a lot of classroom training, a lot of other training, additional monitoring, etc. But with this limited fiduciary model, you can actually take all of those off the table. Because chances are, and again, I haven't looked at any of your specific firm situations, but most of you, I am fairly confident, are already meeting what would be the requirements to operate under this, or at least have the policies and procedures in place that you could operate under this exemption. So what is not required if you are using this limited fiduciary model would be retraining of staff. Your current training, provided that you are already asking your rep not to make recommendations, is going to be sufficient. There's no need to do that retraining. Also, you can avoid that degradation of service, that paralysis by fear, which I am certain that we will see in many contact centers. You can also, it doesn't require you to discontinue certain practices, specifically looking at, and that could fall under this level fee exemption, would be providing rollover recommendations and recommending financial advisors, again, provided that you have policies and procedures in place, which I would hope that anyone who is recommending an advisor or a rollover already has in place. So therefore, you really don't, there's no requirement for a major overhaul of policies and procedures. Certainly we'd want to take a look at them, and we'll get to that in a second when I talk about the audit. But more likely than not, you already have the necessary policies and procedures in place to operate under this exemption. What is required is that there is no variable compensation, so that it is a level fee. Again, most of you probably have a salaried model of compensation within the contact center. There is a possibility that there could be some incentives that might need to be revisited, particularly around things like IRA rollovers. But by and large, you're already meeting that highest bar to operate under this exemption. The next step would be notice to participants, plan fiduciaries, and IRA beneficiaries. Certainly something that would be very easy to include in a simple insert the next time your statements go out. And then something that long-term could simply be added to applications to get every one of your new shareholders or participants to agree to it right off the bat. You do also need authorization to operate under this exemption. However, that can be done very easily right within the IVR before they get to that representative. And then the final component is an annual audit, something to make sure that you have these policies and procedures in place, that you are not, and that you're training your representatives not to make recommendations, not to provide advice. And then the final advantage is final benefit is a competitive advantage. And that takes two forms. First, you have the service advantage, removing that fear-induced paralysis, allowing your representatives to focus on meeting the customer's needs rather than spending all their time worrying about potential liability. Many of your competitors will see a reduction in service quality. So if you're able to maintain your current service standards while your competitors are cutting back, that gives you an edge. Also, you can recommend advice providers. Now, this is certainly something that would have to be added to that audit, but as long as you have policies and procedures in place that are appropriate, you can continue to recommend advisors to your customers, which again, that's a service advantage because many of your customers are actually looking for those recommendations. can also provide you a distinct market advantage by making you able to continue recommending rollovers, again, assuming that there are policies and procedures in place to make sure that they're appropriate. Really, it will let you keep those assets in-house while some of your competitors are losing those assets by not being able to make those recommendations. So let me just do a quick check. So some next steps. Hopefully we whetted your appetite and you have some interest in maybe exploring this 408G level fee exemption a little bit more. My colleague Brooke Halloran will be sending up a follow-up email after we are done here today. We will include these slides as well as a little bit more information about it. The next step for you, if you are interested, certainly introduce this idea to the larger group in your organization, that Fiduciary Rule Task Force that I'm sure most of you have. In fact, some of you are probably members of that task force. The next step would be to set up a call to discuss your particular situation. So rather than talking about it in the abstract, we can talk about it in the context of your specific firm, the specific services that you're offering. In doing so, we would certainly look to include DALBAR's President Lou Harvey, who really is one of the nation's foremost experts on the Pension Protection Act in general and the fiduciary rule specifically. There we can talk about some implications and requirements to actually take advantage of this exemption, and just talk to the suitability of this limited fiduciary model within your firm. We are able to complete these 408G audits. Also, pre-audits is certainly something that we can do. And then one thing I did just want to note is that the elements or the complexity really could vary from one organization to the next, really based on exactly what services are you looking to continue, and what exactly you're looking to do with that. And that really does require further conversation, but a conversation that we are very happy to have with you. And on that note, I want to open up to questions. Let me just see if I can get these questions a little bit bigger on my screen. There we go. That's much better. All right, I have a question here. If we provide a disclosure during the call or in the phone system prior to accepting the incoming call, will that cover us if we accidentally provide a recommendation during the course of the call? And the answer to that question is yes. Assuming, again, that you have the proper policies and procedures in place, so there, if we were going to do an audit, we would want to be looking at those training materials, make sure that you're training to that. But as long as everything is in place and you're operating under the 408G exemption, yes, providing that disclosure during the phone, during the IVR. Now this does have, you do need them to express consent, so it would be a case where they would have to press 1 or say yes to continue, but that is all it takes, yes. From there, any accidental, again, as long as it's not a routine behavior, you would be covered in those cases. Another question is, the 408G exemption seems too good to be true. Why wouldn't everyone want to do it? And you know what? I admit it, definitely there are some real advantages to this. And a lot of firms, the contact center is not necessarily their first concern with the fiduciary rule. So it's certainly on the list, but not at the very top of the list. A lot of firms are taking advantage of 408G in other areas to deal with other aspects of the business. It's extremely applicable within the context of the contact center. And I certainly would expect more firms to start looking to take advantage of this, this exemption. Another question we have. So I got a question specifically to the SQM program. The question here is, would a representative be dinged for being overly cautious? And that is a difficult question. Being cautious in and of itself is not a problem. However, if in the course of being overly cautious, they're not doing what they should be able to do to address that customer's needs and answer their questions, you certainly could see areas where a representative would lose points because the client's experience is suffering. So not losing points just for not making a recommendation, but if they really go to the extremes, like in that little clip that we heard, which it was admittedly a little bit tongue-in-cheek, yeah, in a case like that, we would undoubtedly see some deductions for some point deductions within the service quality measurement program. We also got a question here about how soon the webinar will be posted so that others can listen in to determine if there's interest at your specific firm. I will look to get that posted, perhaps not this afternoon, but it will certainly be available online tomorrow. And it may very well be posted later this afternoon. And Brooke will certainly send out a follow-up email to let everybody know once that is available. I have another question here about what does a 408G audit entail? That is more in Corey's field of expertise, so I will let him handle that one.
Sure. So, you know, within the context of the call center, the scope of the audit would be much narrower than it would be in the scope of an advisor. But it would start first with verifying that the fee is level, that one is not receiving a greater fee based on the recommendations that are provided. So you know, that's not going to be a big hurdle in the call center context, but we certainly need to be able to verify that. We would be verifying that you're using generally accepted theories, processes, and procedures. And this goes to what Brendan was saying, is that our job as the auditor is to ensure that you have those processes and procedures in place. They are generally accepted. And so if there is a deviation from that as a one-off and not part of a routine, as a routine thing, then it would not necessarily take away the relief that you were granted under this provision. And we also are making sure that the appropriate disclosures and agreements are being utilized. So our audits are retrospective. It's after you've been operating under it for 1 year. And so we're taking a look at your process over the last year and making sure that you're following all the prescribed procedures. But again, I'd say the three biggest, I mean, there's some other smaller ones, not to get into the nuances, but for the most part, it's the levelization of the fee, it's the processes and the procedures, and it's the appropriate notifications and agreements. And with regards to the agreements, those, again, in the call center context, not going to be too burdensome. So that's the audit in a nutshell.
So let me take a look and see if I have any other questions. I believe we have answered all of the questions that we have. If anybody does have an outstanding question, speak now or forever hold your peace, I believe is how the phrase goes. Excellent. Well, hey, thank you everybody for joining us today. Looks like you'll get a few minutes back in your schedules. We will definitely, Brooke Halloran will be following up with an email. We will let everyone know once this replay of this webinar has been posted online. And thank you again for your time. Have a great afternoon.